The book is basically consists of conversations with 6 prominent reform thinkers. It's about their own journey to knowledge, how they came to know the way that they know Islam now.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Assalamu alaikum.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I ask Allah's forgiveness for the frailty of being human, for any errors that I might make. It is, of course, my pleasure to have my friend and companion along the way, Dr. Ziba Mir-Hosseini. I'm going to read off her bio and not start ad-libbing all the wonderful things that I want to say until after she has a chance to talk. Dr. Ziba Mir-Hosseini is a legal anthropologist specializing in Islamic law, gender, and Islamic feminism, and a founding member of Musawa. She received the American Academy of Religion 2015 Martin E. Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion. A professional research associate at the Center for Islamic and Middle Eastern Law, SOAS, University of London. She has published books on Islamic family law in Iran and Morocco, Iranian clerical discourses on gender, Islamic reformist thinkers, and the revival of Zina laws, and most recently the co-edited Gender and Equality in Muslim Family Law 2013, and Equality in Muslim Family Law, Gender and Equality in Muslim Family Law and Men in Charge, Rethinking Authority in Muslim Legal Tradition 2015, Justice and Equality in Muslim Marriage, Towards Egalitarian Ethics and Laws. I have yet to see my copy of that one. She co-edited 2 award-winning feature-length documentary films on Iran, Divorce Iranian Style, 1998, and Runaway in 2001. And we are here to talk about her latest book, which is Journeys Toward Gender Equality and Islam. I love this cover. Ziba Jan, you have the floor.
Thank you. Amina Jan, it is an honor to be here and talking to you. And thank you for inviting me to talk about journeys towards gender equality. And the book, I started thinking about the book in 2009, and I finished it in 2020. So it has been in the making for a long time. And the book is basically consists of conversations with 6 prominent reform thinkers. It's about their own journey to knowledge. And what I was so interested to understand was really how they came to know the way that they know Islam now. What was their own journey to knowledge? And for me, that was very important because it was also intertwined with my own journey to knowledge. And I have been working on family law, on Muslim marriage for the past 40 years. And the background of the book is political Islam and how it changed everything that we know about Islam and the perceptions of Islam. And at the same time, the rise of new voices in Islam, especially feminist voices in Islam. So that is the background to the book. And I want to say that the book is also about my own journey. So I talk about it in the introduction of the book. And so what I want to say is a little bit about my own journey and a little bit about what the book is composed of. And then we can have our conversation, that is what I'm really looking forward to. I would say that since 1979, after the Iranian Revolution, I really came to experience a different face of Islam. Because, I was born as Muslim, even if not practicing, I'm a believer. And and I believed in justice in Islam. And when the revolution happened, gradually I saw a different exercise, a different performance of Islam. So it made me to ask questions as an anthropologist. And in 1980s, my research was focused on marital disputes. I'm a legal anthropologist. My training was in anthropology. So basically, I wanted to understand what does it mean to be married and divorced in Islam. And I did field work in family courts in Iran and in Morocco. And that was during the 1980s. In 1980s, between 1985 and 1988 in Iran every summer, and then in Morocco. And it was in the course of this field works that I could see that really what we know as Islamic law and what is introduced to us as Islamic law is actually a total construction. It's constantly changing, it's constantly interpreting. And in my research, I was interested in women's strategies. And I could see how women can turn those elements which are oppressive on their head and use it. And later on in the 1990s, my own interest moved. And it moved towards understanding the construction of gender in Islamic law. And again, as an anthropologist, I started working with, started learning fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, and did field work in Qom. And that was in 1990s. And meanwhile, in Iran, things were changing, and a new women's magazine was coming out called Zanan, which was both feminist and Islamic, working with an Islamic framework. And I got to know about Sisters in Islam and their work, and I could see that a new movement is coming. And in my 1980s work resulted in my first book, Marriage on Trial, and 1992 in my second book, Islam and Gender, which is conversations with the ulama, conversations with the clerics in Rome. And it was then that I realized that there is not only one perception, one construction of gender, but at least three conflicting ones. And also I would say that it was in Rome when I was doing research, because I lived there for 3 months in a house of a low-ranking cleric. And also I could really see how women were reacting and how religion is used as a means of oppressing. And I must say that I became an Islamic feminist in Rome. And it was because I didn't want to be only a participant. I want to be claiming my position there and have a voice there. And there was an incident in Qom that for me was really a turning point. And I want to talk about that incident. And I have written about it. But now looking back, I think it was a turning point for me. It was towards the end of my fieldwork in Qom, and I was introduced there to a women's magazine that was established in Qom soon after the women's magazine in Tehran came about. And this women's magazine was run by clerics. And the entire editorial board were clerics, and all the articles were by clerics. So through my cleric friend with whom I was studying, I was introduced to them. So we started a conversation, and later on both of us recorded that. And again, through them, I was introduced to Grand Ayatollah. So it became all a conversation. And towards the end of my stay in Qom, and of course, when you are in Qom, you can never be alone with a man in a room. And so my cleric's friend's daughter was all the time with us. And one day, and I used to spend a lot of time in mosques and the shrines as well. And one day in the shrine, my cleric friend said that, come, and a great Ayatollah was going to talk. And women are not allowed in these spaces. So there was a big balcony there, veranda, and I was sitting there trying to listen. And you could see that boys were coming and going out of the room because their shrines are also the centers of religious learning. And I was not allowed, and I was sitting there with Zahra, and the khadim, who is the custodian, came and started shouting at me and said, "What are you doing here? You women, you should loitering here." And at that moment, I lost my temper. And I shouted back and I said, "Who do you think you are? You are here to serve my ancestor," because I'm a Sayyid as well, the descendant of the Prophet. And the shrine Hazrat Masume was there because that was a sister of one of the imams who died there and prayed there. So I told him that, you are here because of a woman. And this shrine is there. And all this, so this big voice, and I have a loud voice. And he backed off. He backed off and said, no, I didn't mean you, but, women are here and loitering. But I couldn't stay. I went out and I was so angry. And I've never been that angry. Angry with myself for shouting out, boasting about my own education and also my ancestry and all this sort of thing. But for me, it was a turning point. And it was, I think, about turning point, that it is later on that you understand that their impact as well. And I think I became a Islamic feminist then. And before that, I had a lot of hesitation. I didn't want to identify with Islamic feminism because for me and for many people at the time, to be a Muslim feminist meant Islamic feminists meant to be advocates of political Islam. So that was a turning point. And I now want to, later I met with Zaina Anwar, I met with Amina Wadood. Of course, I knew Amina Wadood, but, meeting them and going to Malaysia was another turning point. And it was there that I could really feel comfortable because I could be both a feminist and a Muslim, and I didn't have to justify my position constantly. So I say this long background because journeys towards gender equality and the conversation with reform thinkers is somehow, for me, is the continuation of the research that I did in Qom. In Qom, I talked with the clerics, but not from an egalitarian position. I asked questions, and I was towards the beginning of my own journey. So I could never ask direct question. I could never challenge things. But for journeys, in 2009, after Musawa was launched, which was another important turning point, and it was after the Green Movement in Iran, 30 years after an Islamic Republic, there was an opposition from within. And I was hopeful. I was hopeful for a new discourse. And it was then that I started talking to reformist thinking. And the first person that I talked was Abdullahi al-Naim. And this conversation was an egalitarian conversation. We could talk, and what my main purpose at the time was that to introduce their work to the wider audience, to introduce their work to the activists so they can use it. But as I said, as the conversations continued, then I became interested in their own journey, in their own way of knowing. And so the first interview was 2009 with Abdullahi al-Naim, and he is one of my heroes. He was one of the first who opened a new conversation between Islamic law and human rights. And his mentor, Taha, Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, is so much present in his work. And the second set of conversations started with Amina Wadood and Asma Lamrabit, and that started in 2012. But of course, both with Amina and Asma Lamrabit, we were friends, and I admired their work, and the conversation between them took place as Musawa's research project on Qawam and Wilaya we were working on that. And both Amina and Asma are part of that project and in men in charge. Then the fourth conversation is with Khaled Abul Fazl. And Khaled Abul Fazl, again, I was very much influenced by his work. And I don't want to talk about but what really I realized about Khaled Abul Fazl is the role of his wife, because I went to their house for the interview and everything, and I could see that how much the feminine influence is in his thinking, and also the impact of his mother, and the way that his education began with his mother. And the last two conversations are with two Iranian thinkers, Mohsen Kadivar and Sadiqa Vasmaqi. And what I do in the book with Iranian thinkers are my own context as well. So I provide some background to the developments and in Iran, and also to their own journey, because both of them are two courageous reform thinkers. And so the book is about conversations, and I wrote it in an accessible way, because what I wanted to do is to have a conversation with them and take them out of the academic framework so we could talk. And of course, I edited and tried to have thematic content as well as chronological, but it is, whatever it is in that book is the conversation among us, and I provided some context. So I feel that I didn't write the book on my own. I wrote it with these 6 incredible people. And I wrote it in the course of, it took a long time. I was doing even interviews in 2020 with Sadiqa Vasmaqi, who is an amazing Iranian woman. And what she does, she uses usuli fiqh methodology in order to challenge what the fiqh, how the fiqh is constructed. And her main argument is that the fiqh needs to be limited to the area of ibadat. So I think I stop here because I wanted to give a background and as well as the content, something about the content of the book.
Thank you so much. Actually, I've never heard the story about your argument with the Ayatollah in the home shrine. That's quite fascinating. I'm just going to hold up the book again because I just think the cover is so beautiful. Did you design the cover, or did you have someone do it for you?
No, it was the publisher, One Word, that designed it, and it's absolutely beautiful. Yes.
Okay, so it's a little awkward talking about a book in which I am featured as one of the chapters. So we'll pretend that I'm not there just for a second, because I want to say certain things about in the context of Ziba's writing and the way I've been very heavily influenced by her writing, her thinking, because I don't think in concrete terms. I think in sort of abstract theological terms, and it works very well for me because that's the way my mind wants to think. And yet, of course, being a part of Sisters in Islam and being a part of Musawa, I was challenged to go beyond the abstract into the concrete. But you came in, as an anthropologist, and then you tackled, a lived reality with regard to the way that divorce is being adjudicated in Iran. So you had like a much more compelling sense of the importance of grappling with that, as a way forward. And so by the time I met you, you had already done quite a bit of work along those lines. And at the same time, we, collaborated with certain things, with regard to conferences and stuff like that, for Musawa was launched, and eventually working together more closely since Musawa. But I do want to say that, I do feel like this is accessible. I think that some of us as scholars, who are interviewed here, we still talk in hyperbole, so it's not like it's not without some very rich content, but we give that content in conversation with someone, yourself, with someone whom we have already been in conversation, and also whose knowledge we respect to such an extent that I did not feel I had to give sort of a condensed version or a dumbed down version, what I had to say. So in a way, it's sort of the way that the conversation went, at least for me, personally, the way that the conversation went allowed me to talk out, the process, the journey, allowed me to talk it out, while at the same time I still keep in mind, the sort of theological points, or abstract, reasoning that's still important to me. I find that I was also reintroduced to Muhsen Kadivar and to Abdullahi and Naeem and Khalid Abu Fadl and Asman and Robert. Like, there are things that I learned about them because you managed to put together your having engaged with the scholarship of these persons, but also, with them as persons. And so in the way that you bring it forward, I mean, for example, Khalid Abu Fadl's books are very thick. And yet he's also, very personable. And so when you put it in a kind of conversation mode, you end up having him also kind of talk through in a way that's like more accessible with regard to some very complex and very challenging ideas with regard to reformist Islam. Even the point that you raised about the influence of Grace, his partner, and his mother in terms of his journey, it kind of like humanizes, a scholar that, one has learned who they are mostly through their work. I mean, I know him and I met him literally only once, but it's a certain way that I think you have uniquely the capacity to be able to bring it out, because you are really familiar, with the works of these people, and you are not only familiar with it, but you embrace the challenges that you face with regard to their work, and you ask them about challenges that they face with regard to the work in such a way that it just brings out a very rich portfolio. I mean, it's sort of like an intellectual portfolio, but at the same time, it is more accessible than sort of, just writing your own treatise. Obviously, I'm impressed when you write your own treatise, because as I said, I have learned so much. I continue to learn from you. But I think that, if people really want to have like, a very accessible but very rich sort of thumbnail about Islamic reform on the matter of gender, that this is just such a marvelous place to start. I know that sometimes when there's a subject that I'm interested in, I kind of want to, it's like, can I kind of get what's that called? Not a blue book, yellow book, those little reduced books, I want to get a reduced version of it before I read a very thick, long thing, because before I can get through that thick, long thing, I kind of have I need to kind of have a framework. And this gives you just such a marvelous framework that, I mean, it's, I don't know whether or not, I know Sulus, I know Kedivar, and I know he also does some publications in English, but I don't know whether or not Siddiqui Basmagi does any writing in English. So whether or not I can actually get access to her works at all, is different, but you do feel like, oh, I'd like to go and read more of their work, just from the way in which you kind of shaped the introduction, It doesn't sidestep the importance of the production of knowledge in the lives of these people. So, it both humanizes them and at the same time has deep respect for their scholarship. So, that's one of the things that's kind of a plus. I do want to say that because you mentioned that, you spoke with me and you spoke with Asma over a longer period of time, that the process of talking with you, when I was talking with you, I didn't think about what the product was going to be. And I'm kind of curious, I have a few questions, with regard to the process for you. For people who don't realize it, because there is so much quote unquote conversation that you do transcribe, there's a lot of work that goes into it. I mean, you said it's sort of like you wrote it in partnership, with these other scholars, because we do get to speak, our own words. But at the same time, you have to go and you have to transcribe it. And then I remember after you transcribed, you ran things past me so that, if I speak too fast, as I often do with my American English, and anything was not understood, we could kind of clarify it. But I just wanted to ask about that process for you, that as a writer who has produced her own works, what was it like when you kind of have to go back and forth between other persons before you can come up with a finished manuscript? What was that like for you?
It was a discovery because I recorded all this conversation. And at the very beginning, when I started this book in 2009, and I talked with Abdullahi Al-Naim only in one session in 2009, whereas I talked to you and Amina several, through the period of 4 or 5 years. And even I came back to you both and Amina, both you and Asma, asking questions and filling the gaps and also asking you to tell me and recording it. I remember that clearly. And so I had no idea what I'm going to do it. My first idea was that I'm going to, because these conversations speak for each other. They are so rich, both theoretically, theologically, and jurisprudentially. They were rich. They were like textbooks as well, like lectures. I thought that they would speak for themselves. And then as I was coming towards the end of it, I realized that no, I got to provide the context for them because I want to introduce, because these conversations are happening at the background of me knowing so many things about their work. So I need to introduce their work. So what I did was, first of all, I transcribed everything. And then I decided to arrange it. As I said, I wanted it to be chronological because I was looking at the journey, as well as thematic. And then I decided that it's good to have the same thematic for everyone and the issues that are there. So there is a format to it. But it was a lot of work. And I think I would not have never finished it without COVID. Because when the COVID, I couldn't travel, I couldn't do anything, and I was not teaching that year. So I started working on the transcripts. And at the end of it, I also decided to add a chapter on my own to provide the background, to provide the background to issues at stake, gender, Islam, Sharia, and equality, because these were the main issues that we discussed. So it took me a year and a half to, when not the interviews, because I've done them for during an extended period, but writing took me a year and a half. And but I also, for me, it was so important not to misrepresent, not to misquote. And so when by the time that I decided, what the interviews transcripts is going to be like, so I shared it, and there were some corrections done because dates were not accurate, or I did not understand certain things because you speak very fast, Amina as well. So all this I checked, but and I'm so glad that you felt that it was accessible, and also you felt that it actually represented you, and it was so important for me not to misrepresent, and to understand your work accurately. And for me, it was wonderful because I had to go back to your previous work, earlier work, and all this, read that in order to understand this. So it was an educational process for me as well.
I'm curious about whether you, I mean, I can sense, a little bit of tension, for example, in your chapter, with Abdullahi. But I'm curious, what did you find the most challenging? Because you do let each of us speak. You don't try to shape. You still remain as the interviewer. You still remain true to yourself. So you won't push certain things or ask questions. But was there something that came from this process of the interviews with these scholars that you've been familiar with all these years that you found particularly challenging, but also something that you found pleasantly surprising? So I want both ends of that spectrum in terms of.
Yeah. With Abdullahi al-Naim, there was really, we had a lot of challenges. And when we started our conversation, and the main challenge with him was about the distinction between Sharia and fiqh. For me, that distinction is very important because it enables us to be critical of the jurisprudence, of the construction of legal laws and construction of knowledge, but at the same time remain within the framework. So without making that distinction between Sharia and fiqh, Muslim feminists, I feel that they have nothing to say because, the moment that they talk about fiqh, it is seen as a critique and an assault on Sharia and Islam, which is not the case. And I myself did not make that distinction in 1980s when I did field work in family courts in Tehran and Morocco. Exactly why? Because nobody made that distinction. The judges did not make that distinction. And everybody was talking about Sharia. This is Sharia law, this is Islamic law. But you never ask, who's Islam? What interpretation of Islam? How they come to get this, to this law. So I didn't ask, and I was an anthropologist, and I have only one footnote in the book and making the distinction because the distinction is inherent in the Islamic legal tradition. It has always been there, but it was obscured in modern times. And with Abdullahi al-Naim, he does not make the distinction. He sees the distinction as an intellectual dishonesty. And I was in previous meetings with him when his second book came, Secular Islam and Secular State. Yeah, a secular state. And there was a panel in his honor, and I was one of those. And I actually challenged him at that time. And again, as part of the New Directions project, the first time that I met Abdullahi al-Naim was in 1993. We also had this argument. So I was determined when I had the opportunity to be with Abdullahi al-Naim in 2009 in a conference to have this conversation. So I started by asking this because I told him that I want to sort this out between us. I want to understand because I really wanted to understand why he doesn't make the distinction. In some ways, he does make the distinction, but he doesn't want to use that terminology. So that became a bone of contention between us. And so many times we talked across each other and we did not get to an agreement. That was one thing that was challenging for me, and that was in 2009. Another thing was that he actually he saw no point in engaging with the centers of Islamic learning. At that time, it was very important for me, and still it is important, because if you want to change a legal tradition, you got to engage with those who think differently from you, who are supporters of the pre-modern and patriarchal. And this is a conversation that needs to be had. And he saw no point in it. And he thought that, the centers of Islamic learning like Hosseini in Iran and also Al-Azhar and all these are vested in power. And you cannot have a conversation. And so these two were two bone of contention. And another one which became personal was that he actually did not acknowledge the important role of women scholars. He thought that, what have they done to bring a new fiqh? And what have they done? They focus on Quran, and that is not enough. So the conversation was tense. And when I wrote it down, and of course, I had to cut so many things because we just talked across each other, repeated. And at the end, I think when I sent it to Abdullahi and Naeem for his approval to see whether I got it, he actually wrote an introduction to it. And basically said something which was very clear about the distinction between Sharia and fiqh, and wanted to start from that. And I didn't observe that because, I did it, but I put it towards the end because for every chapter I have an introduction and introduce the work and the circumstances of our conversation and the conversation and an update. So I put it in the update. And at the end, he make a point argument for not making the distinction. And I produced something from my previous writing when I thought that in conversation with him that distinction was important. So in some way, we agreed on so many things. And it is so good because he challenged me on so many things. And for instance, when he said that there's no way, Ziba, that you can get the ideas of these clerics to change, work with the centers of Islamic learning. It came true with Asma Lamrabet when she had to resign because in Morocco, she was the first woman who became the director of women's studies in Rabita Muhammadiyah, which is a clerical organization, a network of clerics. And she faced so many challenges. And at the end, over the question of inheritance, because at that time, I think these things happened in 2017. And at that time in Morocco, there was a conversation and a debate about changing inheritance laws. And she was in a panel in an academic meeting, and she said that there is equality for women in the Quran in matter of inheritance, but not in fiqh. And the ulama took offense, and the director wanted her to publicly take this back. And she said, I can't do that. And if you want, I resign. And his resignation was accepted, which was really a real shock for her. But it had some positive impacts in Morocco, at least, because she was until then very much criticized by the secular feminists. And then that event made them realize that no, you can argue for equality, remain faithful to your faith, but at the same time remain faithful to your feminist ideals and principles.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You're gonna.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we keep, we're constantly engaged with the challenge about whether or not we can make a collaboration between the feminist ideals and the quote unquote tradition. And in some ways, I see how it is that people are limited to the divide. Because they don't want to think about the subtleties and the nuances of where these things overlap. That's kind of what I try to do, with the Tawhidic paradigm, to basically say, this is the core, of what is Islam. So that is the motivation. And a lot of people can't see that because obviously I was born, in the West. But I do think that so change comes from many directions, and understanding the discourse and developing new knowledge within that discourse. I'm still wedded to the idea that it's important. And the whole idea of the construction of new knowledge in Islam, which I literally took from you, and I remember you made a reference here to the scholar that you were reading who talked about it, and you realized how important it was. But the whole idea that somehow, all knowledge that is Islam had to go only backwards into these sort of classical discourses is something that I actually can't fathom. I mean, I don't understand how people don't understand, like Huma Rijal wa Nahnu Rijal, they're men and we're men, we're human, they're human. I don't understand how, like that keyword construction, that, again, is something that, you introduced to me. I don't understand how people actually feel like it is written in stone or blood or something, to such an extent that when you engage with it in terms of the multiple nuances, that somehow you're actually destroying it, or you're a disbeliever. I face it, from whatever, but I'm just saying that if you look at it, the beauty of, Islamic discourses is that it is discourse. And the space for it, seems to have been part of the grand invitation, even with the first revelation, And yet, when we come to, gender, which is, the other thing that was kind of on my mind when I was thinking about this is, why is it that gender equality is such a snare that it just like, they can embrace some ideas to me that just seem far-fetched because it doesn't upset the power relations, but somehow when you do it about gender, people just unravel.
Yes, it is amazing. And also the way that people, when it comes to religion, and I would say even academia do that. They want to put their critical faculties aside and accept it as it was presented to them. And don't see it as a construction. Whereas, what we get from religion is always an interpretation. It's always a construction from the Quran. And this is... and the whole idea of construction, first was, by Iqbal was raised. But it is now, I think, more and more people are coming, at least in the academia, that yes, it is a construction. And for gender, you're absolutely right. I think, the question of gender goes to the core of people's own identity and power relations. And for men, it is absolutely difficult to accept. And also, I want to say, John, it has to do with political Islam. Because, the way that the political Islam used gender, the question of hijab, they wanted women to be, to wear hijab in order to affirm their own Islamic identities. By affirming the Islamic identities, it meant that they were supporters of political Islam. And I must say that I myself in 1980s and in early 1990s, I thought that, if I am called Islamic feminist, because I had difficulty with that kind of feminism and also with that kind of Islam. And I couldn't accept the label. But then it's interesting because I remember in 1990s, after I went to, excuse me, to Iran in 1992, I went back and I saw Zanan magazine coming, and I was one of the first who used the term of Islamic feminism. And all this, I was writing about this. And I was submitting articles to journals. And these articles were not theological. It was based on observation of what is happening and how people are creating a new discourse. Not only women, but men as well. The clerics, some of the clerics were talking about it. And the intellectuals, Muslim intellectuals like Abdul Karim Surush, by making the distinction between religion and religious knowledge, really opened a way. And he had so much influence in my thinking and still has. So there were this possibility that I wanted just to document this. All my articles were rejected. And the reason is that you write an article and send it to a journal, and the journal send it to peer review. And those who are your peer review, if I'm writing about Iran and Islam, are those who have an issue. They have their own understanding and they're challenged. They don't want to see what is happening. So they make a hole in your argument or a fact or something without dealing with it. And I spent a lot of time in 1990s to respond to these things. And but things changed by early 2000. Definitely it had changed. It became possible to be Islamic and feminist. And I remember with you, we have this conversation in that time, but because in your own book, Gender and Women and Quran, you say that I am pro-faith and pro-feminism, but you didn't want to be called Islamic feminist or Muslim feminist. Yeah, very clearly. And I could see that your work is absolutely feminist in methodology, consciousness, everything, but it was not this orthodox feminism of the West and everything. So I remember that we had this conversation and I would ask you, why? And so, and in the book, you talk about it in this book with me. You talk about it so beautifully, how you came to claim that both of them at the same time. And I think this happened in late 1990s, early 2000. And now we are 2022. I don't think, that tension exists.
I think there's still places. I think there's still places, in terms of like, Abdullahi's point about, it's futile to do certain things, in certain places. There are still certain places where there is a divide. So, for example, in the MENA region, there's still a tenuousness. And I find it interesting because I'm not sure what is holding it back, because, you yourself talk about coming to Malaysia, and slash where I am now, Indonesia, across the water. There is a much easier collaboration. And so one does not feel, and it was true for me because I was living in Malaysia and I was living in Indonesia when Musawah was launched. You all of a sudden, you don't feel that you have to choose between your own identities and that they both work together. And eventually it is the sense at which you come to a kind of synthesis within yourself that allows you to then stand up against the challenges that are posed against your simultaneously having those two identities. Otherwise, you do feel forced to choose. And I chose, on the basis of trying to confirm, a priority based, on my own location. But I can see, especially looking back now, that there is a kind of resistance to sort of the sort of spiritual community, the religious communities that, still harbor, that sort of anti-imperialism that they house, within the word feminism. And I didn't want to become a part, of making that split. So I just said, no, I don't need that term. I still say that to people, doesn't matter what you call yourself. But I do know that for me to come to the place where I accepted it, it meant that all of a sudden I could put to rest the internal conflict.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And for me, I think if I hadn't come to Malaysia, I would have not taken that different step, because in 1980s, I was trying to understand what marriage and divorce means in practice and how women deal with it, how the judges deal with it. In 1990s, I was focusing on construction of gender and how the ulama deal with it, how the centers of religious learning are constructing this knowledge. And which I divided it traditionalists and neo-traditionalists and the reformists. And when I came in Malaysia, I think it was that space of meeting you in person and listening to you, and with sisters in Islam, and also with the scholars from Indonesia, which was what they were saying. It was really eye-opening for me, the way that they were talking. All this provided me with a way of getting myself involved in a construction of a feminist jurisprudence. So I would say since early 2000, my work has been on that. And it actually started by Zaina Anwar in that meeting. I think you were there as well. At that time, there was no Musawah. Sisters in Islam had a meeting. And Zaina sent me an email and wanted to invite someone to write a paper on construction of gender in Islamic legal thought, and asked me, what sort of questions they should address. So I wrote something, and she wrote back, why don't you write it yourself? And it was in 2000, at that time, because I remember I was in the process of editing a film with Kim Longinato. And I wrote it, and for the first time, I didn't have to justify my position. I was writing about what I had learned from the reformist thinkers, so I can put it there, and that space provided, and I that is why one of the conclusions that I have in the book is that personal experience is a source of theological and jurisprudential discoveries, because unless you have that personal experience, unless you are in an environment, these things will not grow in you. So most of the time we live in an environment, intellectual environment or family environment or country political environment that suppresses. And in the environment that I lived, it suppressed religion, especially after the Islamic Republic came into existence, because it brought really a pre-modern interpretation of Islam that nobody wanted it. I didn't want that. It was not my Islam. But at the same time, I as an anthropologist, I wanted to understand how they are constructing it. And in the process of understanding, I came to Malaysia and met new people. And I think my research on Islamic feminism opened so many things. And finally, I claimed it. And after the research in Qom, in 1995, that incident happened. And it was in 2001 that I came to Malaysia. And in fact, both that incident in the shrine with the custodian and my anger, and also coming to Malaysia and meeting you and others opened space, for my identity. And I remember in early 2000, after that, I was no longer felt that I have to justify. So I was always comfortable to be called Islamic feminist. And I'm still very comfortable, yes, because, we have the right to produce knowledge based on women's experience from within our faith and tradition. And women's voices were silenced. We don't have any interpretation of the Quran written tafsir by women. There must have been. And it is now that we have women speaking. So their voices were silenced.
It's funny because I kind of discovered that tangentially. In other words, I wasn't looking for it, but I did discover it. And since I started saying that, people have, sort of gone to check for themselves. And they, it's like they must contradict it. They can't be so. Or recently I was seeing someone who was writing that, well, there are statements by women, they're in the works of men. And I think it's really fascinating because, I didn't do the work that I did because of that. I did the work that I did, from a very, loving place. It just happened that, well, why is it important that when I finished, with my graduate research, that one of the things that, I also discovered was that, oh my goodness, we don't even have women's voices in this field. And I started saying it, and guess what? That was a charged statement. But anyway, I don't want to get distracted by that. I was just trying to see if anyone in the gallery wanted to have any comments or questions. But I don't think we do, because I wrote a little note in the chat myself. I also think that for many English reading scholars, there is an overwhelming Sunni preoccupation. So I think it's really important that you have both Musan Kadibar and I always have to check her, Sadiqa Basmagi, because well, I mean, as you said, it's also part of your journey. And, you've already explained how, your journey is like, very much located in where you were doing your research on marriage in the courts in Iran. And I think that that's really helpful for people who, they're trying to get a picture of, obviously reform is, it's going on, in many places and in many ways. And some of it is not even academic, like, currently with the resistance that's going on in Iran and the terrible pushback, that, those who are resisting are facing. There is, that's also reform. I tell people these days, tongue in cheek, without any shame, that I think that the gender reform movement is like the most important articulation of the whole idea of reform. And the reason I say that is because there's so much resistance to it in so many ways, large and small. Whereas the others are either talking about, sort of grand ideas, but they're not necessarily forging an evolutionary revolution with consequences, but at the same time, the movement has not been pushed back. It's like it just continues to go forward. But anyway, I said 2 points there. One about having a scholar from Iran, and second about gender reform.
Yes, this Iran is actually, the work that is going on in Iran is not that much known, and somehow this revolution has been a revolution within the clerical centers of production of knowledge. So unlike what we see is that there are so much new thinking going on. And also women are there, but unfortunately women who are in the centers of religious learning still echo that patriarchal discourse.
Yes.
And some of them have not found their voice. But I think Iran is misrepresented, and the Shia scholarship. And what is so important in fiqh is that within the Shiaism, the Shia ijtihad, one of the elements of ijtihad is reason. And reason is at the same level as revelation. And this idea that revelation and reason never contradict each other. And so reason is very important. And another thing which is so important to the Shia, and they are known as adliya, is the justice. And justice is one of the usul-din, one of the fundamentals of religion. So this justice and also reason provide them with a tool, because this reason is part of the jurisprudence. And Mohsen Kadivar in his work uses this quite a lot. And the same with Sadiqa Basmaqi when she is critically engages with the fuqaha and shows how irrational they are, how much they go against the very principles that they should abide. But in theory, they abide by that, but not in practice, especially when it comes to gender. And so when we come to the traditional jurisprudence, on gender, there isn't much between Shia and Sunni. But I think within the Shiaism, the tools are there. And also the philosophical tradition still has some influence and alive. So I was really happy to do that. And it's also my own context. And I have known this to great reform thinkers, and they are absolutely brave.
So we do have a question from the gallery. Did you detect any patterns in the evolution of these scholars' understanding of gender?
Yes. For instance, I say one by one. With Abdullahi al-Na'im, it was, his experience with the organization that Muhammad Taha was part of it. And they were a group of Republicans. And he was a reform thinker. And he also believed in gender equality. So women were there, and Abdullahi al-Na'im, as a youth, had so many questions. And meeting with Taha, those questions were answered. So that was basically, I would say, from his formation, meeting with Taha, with a reform thinker who was also egalitarian. And Taha's main idea is that we really need to go back to the Quran of Mecca and understand and interpret Islamic jurisprudence in a different way. And I think with Amina Wadud and Asma and Rabet, no, because, my journey was so much intertwined with their journey and understanding. But what I found so interesting was that Amina started from a position that feminism was not that important. For her was the faith, theology, and also the belief. And in my view, Amina, you are one of the great theologians that we have, contemporary theologian. So I had all this thing about Amina. But then the way that by 2009, she actually came to the level of accepting the feminist identity as well as Islamic identity. So the journey started from a different point. Whereas Asma Rabet came from a very secular background. And what really changed her position was that what happened in the 1990s with the first Gulf War. And suddenly she was shaken by the injustice of it, by the double standard of the West and everything. And she went back to religion for solace. And it was a spiritual Islam. And therefore, she actually claimed from the very beginning that she is both Islamic, she is both feminist and everything. So once I remember that I asked her, it is in the book as well. And I asked her that, when you came to identify as Islamic feminism, also I asked her when you took up hijab. She actually says to me that, Ziba, I answer this because you are asking me. But if I was asked by this question by another person, I would not respond, because the assumption is that feminism and Islam cannot stay together. And with Khalid Abul Fazal, I think it was his mother, and he talks about an incident that a girl was sexually assaulted, and then the boys, when he was at school, was talking about it in a way of excitement and everything. And he was uncomfortable and came and talked to his mother, and the mother really spelled everything for him and said, this thing can happen to a boy as well as can happen to a woman. And you should not be ashamed of yourself to be uncomfortable. It is they who should be. And it is this incidents like this. There is another incident that he talks about it. So it's the voice of his mother. And I think the voice of his mother is the voice of conscience for him as well. And with Mohsen Kadivar, it was the reform movement. It was 10 years after the Islamic Republic that he really realized and saw all this injustice. And he talks very beautifully about his own experience. So because he said that in 2000, Mohsen Kadivar was a highly intelligent student. And in Iran, we have this concours, that is entrance exams. And all those who are very good get into engineering or medicine and fields like this. And it is at the time that the revolution happens, and he's a student of mechanical electric engineering in one of the best Iranian universities. And then he decides to become a cleric, and he goes to seminary. So he says, for 10 years, I tried to learn and understand. And so many things which was obvious to him by 2000 became problematic. And it was a political event that brought it. So I think it was the experience of it. And for Sadiqa Basmaqi, she is also extremely bright. She was brought up in a traditional family, but in a traditional family which never, it was imposed. Religion was not imposed on them. And somehow we think that in traditional religious families, there is no respect for women and equality. There is a lot there. And those who come from traditional families, at least in Iran, whom I know, are very comfortable with the idea of rights of women. And if they are true believers, I must say. If they are not, so for her, she was interested. She was interested in religion, and she went in when she was 14 to buy books and read it. And she decided to go, because after the revolution, we had the Cultural Revolution, universities were closed, and she wanted to study theology in Tehran University. University was closed, and she went to a women's seminary. She just couldn't accept the limitations, all this. And after some time, she left and went to university. So it was their own experiences, I think. And for Iran, I say it is the experience of political Islam and the way that women challenge that. And for elsewhere, for those who live in America, they have a different reality. They have a different context. And Asma Lamrabet in Morocco, I very much identify with her context because it's very similar to where I was brought up, my context. It's a different thing. And also being a woman makes a difference as well, because, you see these injustices, you feel it. And somehow for you, it comes a feminist consciousness for that. So, but I see this as a journey which is constantly evolving. So yeah, I would say their own background and experiences and their encounters with others.
Well, that was a fabulous question, and it brings us to the end. So I want to thank you so much for your wonderful company, for your continuous inspiration in my life, for this particular book that's now available from One More Press, One More Publication. I hope to see you soon in the Horn of Africa, and thank our gallery for attendance. And there are more of these friends along the way, friends with books coming up. Next up is Siraj Scott Kubo, who actually wrote his spiritual memoirs about his relationship with his sheikh. So look forward to people joining us on another occasion. Thank you, Jan. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.